It's ding ding, two men in a ring. We put pride in your stride and a quiver in your liver. You want 'em, we've got 'em, coming to you. Loud and proud, he's the biggest, he's the baddest. It's Mr. Gavin Davis on the Gavin Davis Podcast Show.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to part two with fourth degree Elson Gracie, black belt Josh Simon. Josh, I know that you wanted to go back to George Gracie, mate. So
always.
Yeah, go on.
So no, I think that there's so much to talk about with George, but I'll try and highlight very quickly, why he's so important, right? Is we talked about the Zbyszko fight, right? What we didn't talk about was right before the fight, Carlos goes to the newspapers and he says, George doesn't represent the academy.
Right.
So what we're starting to see is this falling out between George and Carlos. And this played out for the next several decades, where there'd be these times where they're at odds, they're fighting each other, they're competing against each other, they get back together, and George is helping Elio train for something. So there's this, I can't say it's always 100% bad, right? But you'll see this with the Gracies and lots of people in their orbit, whether it's Gio Amori, Donato Perez. They're sworn blood enemies and they'll fight them in the street if they see them. They get together to train and prepare for a common enemy. They're complimenting each other in the newspapers and they go back to insulting each other and hating each other. So this is weird cycles that continue to happen, right? But George basically is on the outs with Carlos for lots of his life because of a handful of reasons, right? Carlos is not happy with how George leads his lifestyle, like we talked about with Helson to a certain extent, right? George likes to party. George likes to drink. George likes to gamble, right? There's times when George's weight fluctuates 20 pounds because he's not really training. And that was his argument, Carlos's argument against George in his Zbyszko fight. He's not training. He's out of shape, right? So Carlos was upset that George wouldn't do what he wanted him to do. George was upset with somebody telling him what to do, right? And that was the thing. And George wanted to do his own thing. George also fought pro wrestlers. And this is a very touchy subject for the Gracies because they never wanted to be considered doing fake fights, Elio and Carlos, right? And if you fought a pro wrestler, someone might say, that guy's a pro wrestler, so it's a fake fight. So Elio and Carlos were very careful if they fought a pro wrestler, because there weren't a lot of people to fight. You had to fight pro wrestlers, right? That they would put it in a promotion where it was all shoot fights, real fights. And it wasn't a wrestling promotion. It wasn't a wrestling promoter. There were no other wrestling kind of, fake fights on the card. George didn't care. He wanted to fight. So he would fight in shows that had pro wrestling in them. That was a problem, right? So there's lots of different things where George didn't want to be controlled. George would kind of go, he would leave Rio, he would go to other parts of Brazil, and he would fight 5 or 6 guys that were the local guys there, beat them all. He would then set up an academy of his own or go teach at someone's academy that was set up there and teach for a few months. And then he'd go do it again and go somewhere else. So there's this whole thing. Well, Rio really was set up for Elio and Carlos. There's all these pockets of lineages nowadays that exist that have no tie directly or closely to Elio and Carlos, but are George lineages. He became very close friends with Takio Yano, right? They worked together, they did matches together, they traveled together, they had academies together, and they're so closely aligned that a lot of the lineages, like Euclides Pereira, even Gomez, the Mora brothers, that became famous lineages, they don't separate Takio Yano versus George Gracie. They just go, I'm a George Gracie, Takio Yano guy. So there's all these different lineages that exist today and spread all throughout Brazil, not because of Carlos and Elio, because George kind of had this wanderlust and would travel all over the place, right? But he really fought anyone, anytime, anywhere. And that's something that people, I think, really can like and appreciate is that, except for Elio and Carlos, was much more of a negotiated, careful business decision. George is like, yeah, I'll fight. George fought wrestlers that were, massively huge, bigger than he was, with pinfalls, and George would get pinned and he would lose.
So it sounds to me very, when they say at UFC 1 that they couldn't control Hickson, right? It's very history repeating itself, this.
It is. Like I said, Helson and
like.
Henzo have elements of this stuff too. And they say, like, we just want to fight. Henzo fought 3 different guys on 3 different continents in 3 consecutive weeks, right? So like, George would fight multiple people in a single day. He'd go to the next town and go do it. So he fought forever all over the place. But it really did upset Elio and Carlos because sometimes he would lose or sometimes he would make them, in their minds, look bad or he couldn't be controlled, right? Okay. But it got so bad. And we talked about, the first fight that was important was the Mario Alexo. Let's talk real quick about the last fight, right? Or one of the last ones of his career. Is he did, at a point when things were bad between him and Carlos, the ultimate sin you could do to Carlos, which was you open up an academy in Rio. He opened up a competing academy called George Gracie Academy. That's like the biggest no-no you could do to Carlos, right? So they're going crazy back to in the newspapers every single day talking trash, and they're really going bad. George says, I'll fight you guys. I'll fight Elio. This is a big deal. Gracie's fighting each other in public, not private, not behind public fight.
Yeah.
George's like, I'm in. Carlos doesn't allow it. Or Elio doesn't want to do it.
What year is this about, mate? Roughly what year is this?
It's later on. I mean, I got my notes here. I go in the exact date for you. Is it 50s? It's
because I want to talk about Elio and Santana in 1955 in a second.
Yes.
So is it prior to this? Is it?
It would have been. Let me get it. I don't have it down. Okay, he was 41 at 1952.
1950, prior to the 55 fight, yeah.
Yeah. So, but once again, it's still later on, right?
Yeah.
So George is old. George is in his 40s.
Yeah.
But, so Elio doesn't do it. Carlos, as he normally does, says, okay, I got a guy for you that's going to represent the Gracie Academy. They pick Pedro Hemeterio. So Pedro was the enforcer of the academy. So it's in this time period, kind of when Elio's retired, before Carlson comes onto the scene. Pedro Hemeterio is the guy that fights their challenges.
Yeah.
He fights on TV. Whenever they want to look good, or they want to go smash somebody, it's Pedro. He's like the Terminator. They just kind of point him in that direction and he kills those guys, right?
Yeah.
So the thing is, like, George is in his 40s. He's out of shape, right? He's not training. He's like, yeah, I'll fight him. Sport jiu-jitsu match, right? But once again, Pedro's in his 20s. He's heavier than George. Top athlete. And once again, George goes, I'll get the time frame. Look at this. Sport jiu-jitsu match, they go at it for, I sometimes forget which minutes, which fight ends or whatever else. So what'd they do? They did
20-minute rounds then, were they?
Let me see if I have it. It was 26 minutes was the match until Pedro's able to mount and choke George.
Right.
I don't know if it was one round overall or not, but anyway, he hangs in there against a guy much younger, much more in shape, right? Training harder, and does it. But the thing was, the fact that he lost, it kind of brought him down in the history and kind of once again gave that mantle of ownership to Elio and Carlos.
Okay.
And after that, you don't really see much of George in the story. So he kind of comes on the scene and proves that you shouldn't, it's not so good to learn from books or books exclusively. You need a real jiu-jitsu environment. But at the end, he's trying to challenge against Elio and Carlos, and he loses that challenge. And then he kind of gets relegated from there.
Okay.
Those lineages become very important during the 60s and the 70s when, even Gomez and Euclides Pereira are all fighting. They're all coming out of a Takeo Yano, George Gracie lineage. But in terms of a guy that just fought, said, I'm not going to do what you're going to tell me to do. I'm going to do it the way I want to do it. It was George.
So yeah, just touching on that 1955 fight Elio had with Santana.
Yes.
Now, Santana was a student of Elio and Carlos.
Yes.
Originally. Now,
yeah. So the way it worked was he trained for a couple years in Bahia as doing capoeira and we think jiu-jitsu.
Yeah.
Right. He goes to the academy like 1951. He's still young. Carlson's young.
Yeah.
He trains there for a couple years. Now, during that time period, he represents the academy in challenges and in tournaments, and he's there. He's fighting on behalf of the Gracie Academy.
Now,
so
yeah.
The thing is this, right? The question is, why did they fight? There's several different excuses or reasons or logic that's out there. I'll tell you my take on it, right? People say that because Waldemar, he didn't have a lot of money. He lived at the academy and lived inside the academy. And people did that at the time. And he would, wash the gis and clean the mats and kind of earn his keep by doing that. And that he left the water on running one time and it flooded the academy and they were pissed and they threw him out and that was the whole. Look, there's lots of Gracies and lots of Gracie fighters that did lots of bad stuff over the years. And Elio and Carlos could look the other way if you were winning and Waldemar was winning. So I don't think that's a legitimate thing, right? Mm. The other thing is that Waldemar, he competed in a pro wrestling card. Remember, I told you that was a very big no-no. So that makes sense on the surface. But in
Kimura was doing this stuff back in the day as well, though.
And once again, and Waldemar had 2 matches with Kimura, which people don't know about, right? So we can talk about that if you want. But the thing is so what happened was this was a pro wrestling show. And Waldemar fought a real match on there. That would have been a bad thing. However, in this particular case, Elio and Carlos negotiated Waldemar's contract on his behalf. So obviously they allowed it to happen.
Yeah.
They condoned it, right? So that's not a thing. Voldemort ends up going in a match against a guy who's a super tough guy who João Alberto fought against, Pedro Viterio, Elio Vigil, everyone fought against him, and he was a super tough guy. And Voldemort ended up,
João
yeah.
Roberto, it was Mauricio Gomez's first coach.
Yeah, no, and all these guys were all fundamental parts of that pro team.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
my point is the guy that Voldemort had was a tough guy, and it was a draw.
Yeah.
So people said, oh, he was expelled because he was a draw. And no, once again, there was Elio had plenty of draws, George had plenty of draws, Carlson had draws. Draws were okay, right? The reason why I think, and most of our historians think that the real legitimate beef was this, is it was a pro wrestling show, it was a pro wrestler, it was a draw, that's all real, but they were okay with that. Supposedly, Elio and Carlos said, we want to put some more Gracie Academy representatives in the card for the show to get us more promotion, get us more matches. In theory, the promoter said, okay, I'll do that, but I need to reschedule the show. We got to postpone the show to do that and make it work, right? Now, two sides of the story. Voldemort says, I said no because I had a whole bunch of friends and family coming in from Bahia, right? And this is a poor area. They didn't have a lot of money, and I didn't want to have them have to spend their money to stay in Rio, right, and wait for the event to happen, or send them back and bring them back again. So I wanted my family and my friends to be able to see the event, right? Elio and Carlos said he was being selfish and he wanted to get his payday now and not later, right? But once again, we talked about the big things that upset Carlos and Elio, right? Bigger than the setting up your own academy is going into business for yourself, right?
Yeah.
Anyone that did anything that was putting themselves ahead of the academy, that was it. And like I said, whether it was a family member, whether it was a student, whether it was a training partner, coach, these are always the causes of the blow up. So my guess is that this was really the reason, was that they wanted to get more guys on the card. They thought it would help the academy. For whatever reason, Voldemort says no, whether it was that reason, the other reason, or some other reason, that's the drama. He gets expelled.
Yeah.
Things start going back and forth in the newspaper again. Gracie starts saying he's not a real Gracie fighter. He's not a real Gracie student. He's a guy we brought in to train with some guys. He's a sparring partner. And once again, we see this later on. I lived through that later on with Horian later on. When guys didn't do the performance that Horian wanted, they would distance themselves. Once again, this idea of you had to preserve the image, right? So Voldemort gets pissed. And he goes, look, I'm as good as Carlson. And turns out he was. We just didn't know it at the time.
Yeah.
They get pissed. They're going back and forth. He says, look, the first day I came to the academy, I rolled with Elio. And it took Elio 25 minutes to tap me. Don't know if it's true. Probably was. Once again, he didn't say he beat Elio, right? Elio didn't say, no, it didn't happen. But Voldemort was an athletic guy. He was a tough guy. We know he had a great long history. It may have taken him 25 minutes to tap him. So it goes back and forth. Once again, everyone's insulting everybody. Voldemort says, look, I'll fight you, Elio. Any rules you want. You pick the rules, you pick the format, you pick the duration, time limit, go ahead. I'll beat you in any set you want. So Elio picks Vale Tudo with Geese. No time limit, right? The only thing that Elio wanted was he wanted to do it behind closed doors. Voldemort said, my only rule is we're doing this in public. So they agreed. So that's the start of the match that we know as it comes into.
Because there's a couple of little points I want to touch on about this. So
yeah,
I wanted to talk about Santana's level. So you've already kind of discussed that, saying he was on par with Carlson.
I spoiled
right?
it. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, I'm with you on that, because like the people that he fought and how he did, like he was obviously at top level, right?
Yeah.
I wanted to talk about Elio's frailty, that people that the legend of his frailty, because I read one of your articles about him being a competition swimmer, and that he wasn't as frail as what the superstitions made out to believe.
Yeah. So the question is this: how do you define frail? Right? How do you define small or sickly or weak? Right? And was he at some point in his life? He may have been, but we do know that when he gets into his teenage years, he's doing athletics, right? He's winning swimming championships. He's a coxswain on a boat. So he's in rowing, but he's not rowing the boat. He's the guy that's kind of directing the boat, right? But he is swimming, he is winning championships, at clubs. And the interesting part is there's no mention in the Gracie story. And once again, the Gracies are in the newspaper every single night for decades.
Yeah.
There's no mention of the Elio sickly frail story until decades and decades and decades later. So that's one of the things I think makes us think that was a marketing thing later on, right? And we see that in many, many martial arts, is this idea of there's a sickly, frail, weak child. He gets the power of this martial art and boom, superstar, right? Super warrior. And I think that's part of the marketing. We see it also through the 20th century with a lot of fitness products and gym things and membership. This idea of, you're the 98-pound weakling and you take my program, you'll be strong. So we see this in a lot of different things, this idea of David versus Goliath, or I have a magic solution to your problem. So I think that's where it came from. There's a couple of pictures I posted on the Instagram where Elio looks jacked.
He's shredded, yeah.
Yeah. And this idea, he could never do a pull-up. And that dude could do some pull-ups. You know what I mean? He's in a singlet. He's doing wrestling. He's doing, so he was definitely an athlete, right?
Yeah.
There's no talk about him being so weak and couldn't do things. There's no talk about him magically learning on his own, right? That came to a story once again much later. I think because Rorion wanted to say that Elio owned jiu-jitsu, right? If he said the Gracies owned jiu-jitsu, Rorion's competing against Carlos's sons and grandsons. But if he goes, Carlos is bad, my dad created everything, you have to come to me, don't go to anybody else, that becomes the story that way. So a lot of these things didn't appear in the story to decades and decades later.
Yeah. So with regard to that fight,
yes, let's talk about it.
Elio lost that fight.
He
Santana went on, and then he had 2 matches with Carlson, I believe.
He had 6.
6 matches. Well, I see. I've read he had two of Carlson.
2 Vale Tudo.
2, right. Can you just start discussing that for us, please?
So what happens is this is kind of this interesting period of time where things start going on this upswing, and there's a lot of competitive matches going on. So basically, Carlson and Valdemar, they have like a match a year for the next 6 years, right? So they don't fight frequently, but they keep fighting. But on top of that, there's always other guys coming into the scene over the next few years. Like I said, even Gomez, Euclides Pereira, there's lots of guys fighting. Kimura comes back. So there's a whole period, I call it the television era, because things start going on TV, things start getting filmed, but these guys become real big celebrities for fighting. Now, once again, it's not always Vale Tudo. Right. Sometimes it's no-gi, sometimes it's sport jiu-jitsu. I can give you the dates and the results. But basically, the simple version is they end up going 6 times together. 2 times Carlson wins, 4 times it's a draw.
Right.
And that's what you'll continue to see with Valdemar is he competes for decades against the top guys. And he hasn't stopped competing until he gets in a car accident. That's why he stops competing. It wasn't because of old age. He's still in his 40s and he's still fighting. But what you'll see is there's this super top echelon, Carlson, Ivan Gomez, Euclides Pereira. And Valdemar fights them all, but he either loses or draws, and he fights them all multiple times. But he's not able to beat that super razor-thin top guys, but he kills everybody else, and he just kind of loses those guys. Yeah.
But this is during an era as well where he's in his late 30s, 40s, and they're in their prime, yeah?
It is. There's different things. Carlson and him were the same age, so they're 2 years apart. So they're very close. But yeah, some of those other guys, once again, were bigger. Some of the guys were younger. It's all part of it. He has 2 matches with Kimura. Kimura comes back a second time to Brazil.
Yeah.
And once again, it's hard to tell, right? The first match he does is sport jiu-jitsu, very similar to Elio's sport jiu-jitsu match with Kimura. It's like 4 10-minute rounds. Valdemar lasts to the 4th round, and then he gets Kimura'd. And everyone said Kimura was dominating. Kimura was in control the whole time. Was Kimura taking it easy? Was Kimura putting on a show? In theory, he was doing that for the Elio match. So exactly, you can't easily say like, okay, Elio lasts 14 minutes, Valdemar lasts 40 minutes. It's hard to tell what that means, right? Yeah. But like a week later, they do a Vale Tudo match. And it's a draw. And to me, that's a really big deal. Once again, Kimura wasn't known as a Vale Tudo guy. No. He may have had a knee injury. They talked about that beforehand. But like Valdemar, I told you, he would fight anybody, anywhere, anytime too. And he would go any rule set, but he was a beast to fight in Vale Tudo.
Yeah. Yeah. Another one who gets a little bit lost in the history of BJJ.
Yeah, absolutely.
Definitely.
I talk. George gets taken out because it's an alternative Gracie thing.
Yeah.
Valdemar gets turned into the bad guy of the story, right? But that means then you can't really follow him in the story anymore.
Yeah.
Right. The interesting part where it kind of circles around, we talk about these circles, is all of a sudden it's 1980, right? Now Valdemar's managing promotions and fighters, right, up in the Northeast. He has a guy. He's like, this guy's good. Zulu.
Yeah.
I need to get a match for this guy. Who does he call?
Hickson.
He calls the Gracie Academy. He says, Elio, I got a guy. Elio's like, I got a guy. So they were still very bad for a long period of time. There was a TV show like in the 1960s, right? Where the idea was you bring together celebrities that are feuding and get them to hug it out, right? On Brazilian TV, right? So they had Valdemar and Elio together, and then they did that, and then they went back to Elio was trashing him in the newspapers again. So they didn't have a reconciliation.
What I want to do.
Yeah.
Absolutely loved hearing about that then. Absolutely.
Sure.
I'll digest that over the next couple of weeks. You know what I mean? I want to switch gears a little bit, talk about a few of your articles.
Sure.
So first question on it. How do you feel about belt promotions in BJJ and how they're awarded?
Well, there's so much to it, right? I think the bottom line, and I was trying to get to with the article was this:
with regard to the testing,
I know exactly.
Yeah.
So, what I think there's a problem with nomenclature sometimes, right? Like I said, here at Gracie, Ohio, we do a test. Right. If someone freaks out, it's not exactly a test like you think, like a karate test, right? I look at it more of even though they call it a test, it's a ritual, right? So we're inviting in guys that we already know that we're going to promote, right? And we're putting them through a rigorous training session cycle. I won't get into too many details because we try and keep it, somewhat secret from the guys. But it's not like, go show me this kata or you're going to fail or pay us money, right? So I think that we don't want to get into those things, right? I think that still it's very important that in jiu-jitsu, it's still based upon skill and ability, right? And that we don't get into other types of ways of looking at it, right? If you start saying, I'm going to take money to test you or these other things, does it incentivize people to promote people that shouldn't be, right? If you say, I'm going to test you, then I'm going to fail you, are you going to fail that guy? And are you going to lose a student? Is that going to affect your money? So I want to keep it pure, right? So the point of the article was really like, I don't think we should have a quote unquote test or, a certain, fee you have to pay or process like that, but I do think that it is nice to have a ritual. When I got my blue belt, I was rolling on the mat in exercise. Helson and Steve were there and they threw a belt still in the plastic in between the two of us, me and the other guy. I look up.
Who's it for?
I didn't even know. I didn't even know what it was. I never seen a promotion before. And Steve's like, "Oh, Helson wants you to put that on." That was it. So there was no barbecue. There was no party. There was no whipping you with belts. So there's an informality, right? As part of the website, I interviewed Laborio and Marilla Bustamante and all these guys. They talked about they got promoted, right? Some of them to black belt. They're walking to the academy in acai at the restaurant outside. And they're like, "Oh, hey, Carlson." He's like, "Put on a black belt." And that was it. They walked into the academy. That was the whole, you get promoted by black belt, from Carlson. And that was all it was, he's eating his acai saying, go put on a black belt.
Yeah.
So I think there's a benefit to informality sometimes with it, but not too crazy.
I personally hate the belt whipping. I wouldn't have anyone whipping. I wouldn't have anyone whipping me.
I get it.
For
it's
any
complicated.
Belt. How do you feel about the belt whipping?
Look, I agree. Look, I came from like a weird time, as we know, right? It was very weird. I was watching a Damian Maya and Fabio Gurgel podcast. And look, if you came up in the 90s, you had to be tough, right? Our whole point was it was not jiu-jitsu for everyone. We wanted people to quit. Yeah. That was our goal every day in the academy. Even Steve's goal. Like we weren't trying to get as many people as we could. We wanted a hardcore nucleus. But the whipping thing came later. The reason why I wasn't against it is, we didn't get into my history later on, but I stopped for 3 years, 2 separate times.
Is that because of your injury, mate?
It was a combination of things, right? It was, the main things was about life, having a kid, having a wife, job stuff, the injuries later on really started killing me. But I was kind of said, I can't say this is my priority right now. I have other things to focus on. But it was really hard to come back. It was really hard to get back into it, all those things, right? But the idea was by the time I ended up getting brown and black, I'm like, I've been at this thing for like 20 years. So whip away, right? I didn't care at the moment, right? Because I was like, look, I'm a purple belt for 10 years. Whip me, I don't care. So I didn't care at that time, but I agree that like certain people don't have the same view and it has cultural implications and people are like, I'm a customer. So I don't think you have to do it. I don't think, it's required. But at the same time, I didn't mind it when it happened to me because I was like, I've been waiting 10 years to go from purple to brown,
Do you feel that a lot of people that eventually get their black belts, by the time they get their black belt, they're broken?
Yes.
So for me, that was always in the back of my mind. I always thought to myself,
I watch you talk about this.
I don't want to be a broken black belt. I want to be a black belt that can still do a bit like.
I watched your podcast on that. I really wish I would have seen that somehow 30 years ago. right?
Yeah.
So no, it's a big problem. We came up in this era where it was super, super hardcore training, and most academies don't do that anymore. And, I think there's good and bad to that stuff, but I do think we were very bad on our bodies, not thinking about longevity. No one did. And the interesting part was I was 18 when I started jiu-jitsu, right?
Yeah.
But Steve was 40, 42. So he was an older guy and he was still beating us up every single day. But the idea of what our lives are going to be like, and can I put my socks on now that I'm 47 years old in the morning, never crossed our mind. For me, my big injury was my back. I got this herniation when I was in Switzerland.
Yeah.
And I knew it didn't feel good. I knew something happened, but I never had a major surgery from jiu-jitsu. So I kept training, I kept teaching, I kept rolling. And then about a year into it, I get bent in half, 90 degrees, and I can't stand up. And by the time I had the surgery, like I lost so much of my disc, I really can't make certain movements anymore between my vertebrae, right? So I think that some of those things are, the training's too hard, or it's not productive training, right? There's probably other ways you can still get good without beating yourself up. Guys are now doing for sparring are doing less real sparring, but still doing striking. There's ways you can train without damaging yourself that we weren't doing. I think that's also something that we could do. But the last one is when people get injured, a lot of times we said, just keep training. Right.
Yeah.
I think if I addressed my surgery on the back in the beginning, I probably would still have disc space and still be able to roll and do all my other stuff. Right. So like I waited too long for some things.
Yeah.
I think all of it's bad.
Yeah, I think there's people like I've seen blue belts now that are just absolutely incredible, right? And purple belts. And I'm looking at them and I'm thinking, what? So practically they're getting sandbags so that they can win a major tournament, right? But that major tournament, they might not win that major tournament, right? And then they'll have to wait another year to try the next major. And then I'm thinking to myself, you're doing all this as a blue belt, right? Give them the belts because they're at that brown belt, black belt level.
Yeah.
Right. And then does the competition really mean that much, or does it mean more to be a high level brown belt, high level black belt?
No, look, it's a weird thing when they started having that white belt, beginners, novice tournament. It was like weird. Do you want to be a white belt world champion? Are those guys really white belts? So it's weird. But going back to, like I said, I agree that we train stupidly. I agree that you can train smarter. I agree that I have bad longevity because of it. But Gavin, I'm telling you, there's part of me that goes, I don't want it to get easy. I don't want it to get soft for the next year. I don't, I mean, we can't become karate, we can't become taekwondo, we can't go that route. So I still feel like maybe we push too hard in one direction, but I don't want it to turn too easy on the other side.
No, I agree. So to get a black belt, what do you feel are the main things you've got to achieve and accomplish to get to a black belt? And I'm on about being, so I'll tell you what I think is massively
You're killing me with these
important.
questions. These are hard questions. Okay.
Right. Yeah. So I think one of the most important things for being a brown belt or a black belt is to be a good training partner and to make sure that you're not only helping others, but you're looking after others. To me, that's a massive thing.
No, I get that.
What's your thoughts on it, mate?
And it's like the hard training. I have two conflicting ideologies in my head that I have not solved yet. Right. So, I have a part of the website that you're probably referring to where I talked to Murillo, I talked to Craig Kukik, I talked to lots of different people and said, look, who am I? I'm nobody. You guys are famous people. You guys are important black belts. What does it take to be a black belt? What do you think a black belt means? Right.
Yeah.
And there's two kind of competing things. And I told you, I'm in this weird era, right? I'm talking to Craig, and he's the first American to get his black belt. He's very much came up in the era that I was. And he's like, look, you have to be tough. You have to prove it. You have to be able to beat people. It's not for everybody. Not everyone's going to be a black belt. It's very much that kind of mentality.
Yeah.
I talked to Murillo Bustamante, who really, he's been my idol, even though I was a Helsin guy, he's been my idol since day one, and he was toughest of the tough and the best of the best. And he's like, look, no, it's not about that. It's about being a better person. And it's about, to your point, helping other people. And how are you treating the people around you? And are you a better person because of it? And it's like, it's weird to me to hear it coming from Murillo because I associate him so much with Vale Tudo and the fights and all that other stuff. But I go, is his way more evolved? And I go, maybe that's the right way. But I go, but Craig's way is kind of what I grew up with. So I'm struggling between these two different things, right? Can anybody be a black belt? Does it matter how good you are? I mean, look, my body's all broken. I'm old now. I'm not that great anymore, right? So I go, am I not a black belt anymore? So it gets to be very weird. You know what I mean? If you just hang around the academy long enough, are you automatically a black belt? Is it a participation thing?
Yeah.
I don't have a simple answer.
Yeah. I I don't know. I feel it's a little bit of both. I think you do need that toughness, and you do need that level and that ability and that knowledge base to pass on to others. But the I think the biggest thing that kills an academy is a bully. Someone who's you mean if you get 110, 120 kilo black belt, just smashes everyone, all of a sudden you've got no academy, right?
Yeah.
And then the academy dies, and then jiu-jitsu starts dying.
No, I get it. I think it's very valid. It's just I think the test is this, and I've seen this now because now that I'm older, now that I've been teaching longer and everything else, is we have people coming to the academy, they're in their 50s.
Yeah.
First day.
Yeah.
You know, are you gonna say, okay, you have to go beat everybody in the academy to get your belt?
Yeah.
Are you going to say you have to go win the world championship? What are you going to say, right? They're going to be in their 60s. You know what I mean? Are you going to say because some sport competitive 20-year-old blue belt beats them, they're not a brown belt? Like, so how do we look at certain, normalization because of age, because of injuries, because of these different things? I think the interesting thing is this, right? Is in some way belts are the problem. Look at wrestling. There's no belts.
Yeah.
I mean, you're wrestling. We just go to the wrestling team. We're on the wrestling mat. You could be better than me. I'm better than you. I'm new. I'm old. We just wrestle. It takes some of the craziness away from the belts, is to say, look, maybe Noki's going to do that over the next 20 years. Like, it doesn't matter if Nicky Rod's a blue belt or a black belt if he's smashing people, right? Like, what's J Rod? So, but I think that there could be this potential thing if Nogi keeps going the way it's going, that maybe belts don't really matter. It just matters, you go, okay, you've been training a couple years, you're now on varsity or elite or expert, and there you're in there.
Yeah. Who's the best person you've ever trained with, mate?
Well, someone's going to get offended, right? Whoever I say. But in terms of, a lot of the Gracies, I didn't get a chance to roll with them, or they were just, it was not like a competitive role. They were just being nice or whatever. But like, I did a private once with Shaolin.
Okay.
And I tell people this one is that
just for, is Shaolin the one that Marcelo Garcia put to sleep in the ADCC?
Yeah. Yes. But once again, that's an unfair look at Shaolin, because Shaolin was killing people for his entire generation. So he's one of those guys that got his black belt like in 3 or 4 years.
They underestimated Marcelo that year because that was
no, absolutely. He was an alternate and no one knew. But Shaolin, through all the 90s, multiple time world champion, he did it all, right?
Yeah.
So I did a private with him in New York. His academy's there. And it was very humiliating, right? Because I was purple at the time. I was probably 10 pounds heavier than him. But I remember, like, he passed on me, right? And he just hung out on top cross side. He wasn't holding me, no grips. He was just kind of chilling off to the side.
Yeah.
Like, he wasn't even chest on chest.
Right.
And Gavin, I'm bumping, I'm rolling, I'm pushing, 100% strength. He's just this. Didn't even move. Didn't have to do anything. I'm like, I don't know what's going on here, but there's a 170-pound guy and nothing's happening. So that was just very humiliating to me from that kind of thing, from a guy who was like a competitive world level guy at the time when he was a competitive world level guy. That was very horrible for me.
Do you get into New York much and train Henzo's?
No, I never got to the Henzo thing. That was the interesting part. When I talked to Craig, right? It's a whole other, once again, hopefully you'll have me back one of these days.
Oh, definitely.
4,000 more stories.
Hey, I could have you on all week. Like, this is incredible.
We'll see if people like it. But Henzo and Craig came down to Philadelphia. It was one of the craziest things ever. And they opened up an academy right next door to Maxercise. Right. So this was World War III, this idea of this turf thing about, Horion having this and Henzo coming in. And I talked to Craig now 30 years later. He's like, I was so amazed you guys didn't come train with us. I'm like, we weren't allowed to. We weren't allowed to go anywhere else. So there's a huge part of my jiu-jitsu time where you couldn't even talk to people. If someone changed academies, if somebody moved, if somebody, they're dead to you. It was gang warfare, right? So for a long period of time, it didn't matter who was right here in front of me. I could not do that.
Okay.
So it was a weird thing. And then later on, when people started leaving the Gracie Academy, when Helson left, when Kaiki left, when Hoist left, you couldn't train with those guys.
Who's Hoist under now?
He's by himself.
Just by himself, right? Because
everybody's by himself now.
I just see him on Instagram. He just goes around the world doing seminars. That's all. I don't think he's really got a proper school that he runs.
Helson's the same thing. So a lot of the guys basically said, look, it's just, I can travel the world. I have 40, 50 academies. I do seminars.
Yeah.
And they don't have they still have academies that are there that have been around for a long time. Helson still's got academies in Hawaii. It's just there's other guys that are teaching there on a daily basis. But that's kind of the model that a lot of them have gone to, if they don't want to kind of have roots in one place.
That's fair enough. So, mate, it's been an absolute privilege having you
No,
on.
thanks.
Honest to
Appreciate
God, right? I definitely want to get you back on again.
Sure.
I need to touch base with Drysdale about getting Drysdale back on because I want to review his book. Have you read his new book?
Yeah, absolutely, I have.
Yeah.
But I'll tell you one. I'll give you one last quick one. I know you were trying to kick me off, but
No,
every time
it's
I write
all
an article, before I write the article, I text Drysdale and I give him my thoughts on it. And I was writing an article on Luis Franza. And we can get into it next time if you want, but he totally changed my mind on Luis Franza and the whole Fada lineage and everything else. So I was very happy that he gave me the guidance that he did, but I was super pissed because I had this whole article prepared and he basically said, no, everything you have is wrong. So yes, I definitely stay in contact with Drysdale on that stuff.
I really enjoyed that book, and I thought that I've given my book to Mauricio for Mauricio to read it, because I said, Mauricio, you need to read this.
No, I tell him I'm always so pissed because there's a stub on the website saying I'm going to write about Carlson, and as I was doing that, he wrote the whole book. I mean, how can I top that? What else can I do? Someone's like, every time I try and do something, I'm like, you just did exactly what I wanted to do, exactly the way I want it, better than I could do it. I'm done.
Yeah. Well, mate, thanks for coming on. And as I say, I'll touch base with you again. We'll stay in touch, mate. We'll stay in touch.
Absolutely. I appreciate it. Thanks again.
Right. You take care. Thank you, mate.